Did you know that on a World War II submarine, a man's daily water ration was often just 1 gallon? That's for drinking, cooking, and washing. Did you know the air they breathed could become so foul with carbon dioxide that it caused constant throbbing headaches? And that the only way to do laundry was to tie your clothes to a rope and trail them behind the sub while it was surfaced. The reality of life below the waves was a world away from the heroic images. It was a place of strange rituals, constant discomfort, and incredible psychological pressure. What did it really smell like? How did a man get any privacy? And what happened when someone got seriously ill hundreds of feet beneath the ocean? The answers are found in the small, often overlooked details of daily existence. Number 21. Could you really hide an 80-man submarine? It seems impossible. A 300-foot-long steel tube full of machinery and men moving through the water. Surely something that big makes a lot of noise. But the whole game of submarine warfare was about not being found. And silence was the only way to win. This wasn't just about being quiet when the enemy was near. It was a permanent state of being. The ship itself was designed for stealth. Cork insulation was glued to the inside of the hull, not just for temperature control, but to muffle sounds from within. Machinery was mounted on rubber blocks to dampen vibrations. Anything loose was tied down. A single wrench falling onto the steel deck could create a sound that, to a listening hydrophone operator miles away, was as loud as a church bell. This obsession with sound was codified in the silent running procedure. When this was ordered, everything changed. All non-essential machinery was shut down. The ventilation fans, the air conditioners, the galley equipment, all of it went silent. Men moved around in stocking feet or rubber-soled shoes. They weren't allowed to talk, only to whisper essential commands. They couldn't even drop a fork in the mess hall. The most famous depiction of this comes from German U-boat commander Herbert A. Werner in his book Iron Coffins. He describes the tense moments of being hunted, where the only sound was the drip of condensation and the ping of the enemy's sonar. The American equivalent is found in countless patrol reports. The crew of the USS Wahoo, under the command of Dudley "Mush" Morton, were masters of stealth. Morton trained his crew to move like ghosts. Every man knew that a single careless noise could give away their position and bring a rain of depth charges. The psychological effect was immense. Imagine holding your breath metaphorically for hours on end. Every creak of the hull, every groan of the metal under pressure, sounded like a gunshot in the crushing silence. The men learned to identify the sounds of their own boat. They knew the hum of the gyros, the whir of the motors, the gurgle of the ballast tanks. Any sound that was out of place was an immediate cause for alarm. This culture of silence was a weapon. By being quieter than the enemy, a submarine could get closer, attack, and hopefully slip away without being detected. It was a constant nerve-wracking battle, not against another ship, but against sound itself. What were the precise decibel levels that crews had to maintain during silent running, and how were these levels measured with 1940s technology? Did specific submarine classes like the American Gato class versus the German Type 7 have a measurable acoustic advantage? Are there any documented cases where a crew was discovered and lost because of a single identifiable noise made by a crew member? Number 20, what was that unforgettable smell? Every submarine had its own unique smell. It was a smell that veterans could recognize decades later. It wasn't just one thing. It was a complex mixture of odors that permeated everything. The clothes, the food, the men themselves. And it was inescapable. First, there was the diesel oil. Submarines of that era were diesel electric. They ran on massive diesel engines on the surface, and these engines had a pungent, oily smell that got into every corner of the boat. It was in the air, on the decks, and in the fabric of the men's uniforms. It was the boat's perfume. Then you added the smell of 80 unwashed men in a space smaller than a modern 2-bedroom apartment. Fresh water was strictly rationed, usually to about 1 gallon per man per day. This was for drinking, cooking, and brushing teeth. These showers were a rare luxury, maybe once a week or every 10 days if you were lucky. So body odor was a simple fact of life. Layered on top of that was the smell of the galley. Cooking for 80 men in a tiny, poorly ventilated kitchen produced a constant aroma of whatever was on the menu, usually fried foods, cabbage, or onions. These smells had nowhere to go. They just mixed with everything else. Add to this the scent of overflowing toilets, hydraulic fluid, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the recycled air. The result was what submariners called the smell of the boat. It was so potent that when a submarine returned to port, people on the docks could often smell it before they could see it. Wives and girlfriends of submariners knew the smell instantly. In his autobiography, Clear the Bridge, Rear Admiral Richard O'Kane, commander of the USS Tang, talks about the air quality. He doesn't dwell on the smell in a complaining way, but as a condition of the environment, like the temperature or the humidity. It was just part of the world. The only relief came when the boat surfaced and the hatches were opened. The rush of fresh salt sea air was a moment of pure bliss. For a few hours, the boat could be ventilated. But as soon as they submerged, the smell would begin to build again, a constant reminder of their crowded, confined world. Did the specific diet of American, German, and Japanese submarine crews create noticeably different smells of the boat, and could this have been used as a bizarre form of identification by those with sensitive noses? Were there any scientific studies conducted during or after the war on the psychological effects of living in such an olfactorily overwhelming environment for months at a time? What specific chemical compounds made up this unique submarine aroma, and has anyone ever tried to recreate it for historical or scientific purposes? Number 19, how do you perform surgery in a moving tin can? Medical care on a submarine was a terrifying prospect. There was no doctor. The highest-ranking medical professional was a pharmacist's mate, a man with more training than a basic corpsman but far less than a physician. He was responsible for the health of the entire crew, from handing out aspirin for headaches to dealing with catastrophic injuries. His medical bay was often little more than a small locker and a fold-down bunk. Yet, some of the most incredible medical procedures of the war took place in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. The most famous case is that of pharmacist mate Wheeler B. Lipes on the USS Sea Dragon in September 1942. A 19-year-old sailor named Darrell Rector came down with acute appendicitis. They were deep in enemy waters, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port. The submarine's commander, William E. Farrall, knew that if the appendix ruptured, Rector would die. He gave Lipes permission to operate. Lipes had never performed surgery. He had only seen it done during his training. Using a makeshift operating table on the officer's mess table, under the glare of a single light bulb, Lipes went to work. His surgical instruments were what he had on hand, bent spoons for retractors, alcohol to sterilize them, and sulfonylamide powder as an antibiotic. The submarine dove to 120 feet to provide a stable platform away from the choppy surface waves. The crew was put on silent running to minimize distractions. For 4.5 hours, with the help of a few assistants, Lipes carefully removed the inflamed appendix. He followed the steps he remembered from a medical textbook. Rector survived and made a full recovery. This event, later reported in the Chicago Daily News and detailed in the book The Brevet's Man by William Tuohy, showed the incredible resourcefulness required on a submarine. The pharmacist's mate was everything: the doctor, the dentist, the psychologist. He set broken bones, stitched wounds, and doled out advice. He had a limited supply of morphine, sulfa drugs, and bandages. For anything more serious, he had to rely on his own ingenuity and courage. Every man on the boat knew that if he got seriously hurt, his life was in the hands of one enlisted man with a medical textbook and a steady nerve. Beyond the famous appendectomy, what were the most common serious medical emergencies faced by pharmacist mates, and what were the survival rates for these incidents? How did they handle dental emergencies like abscessed teeth, which could be incapacitating? Are there any documented cases of a pharmacist mate losing a patient during a procedure and the subsequent impact on the morale of the tightly knit crew? Number 18, were they slowly suffocating? The air you breathe is about 21% oxygen and less than 0.04% carbon dioxide. On a submerged submarine, those numbers change dramatically. With 80 men breathing in a sealed tube, oxygen levels dropped and carbon dioxide levels rose, and the CO2 was the real enemy. As CO2 levels in the air climb, it affects the human body. At 1%, you start to breathe faster. At 2%, you can get headaches and shortness of breath. At 3% and above, your judgment becomes impaired, you feel dizzy, and you're constantly gasping for air. This was a daily problem for submarine crews. The primary method for removing CO2 from the air was through a chemical called lithium hydroxide. It was spread on mesh trays or stored in canisters, and fans would circulate the boat's air through it. The chemical would absorb the CO2, but the supply was finite. A captain had to balance the need for clean air with the need to conserve his CO2 absorbent for a long patrol. Submariners got used to living with a CO2 headache, a dull, persistent throbbing at the back of the skull. They knew the air was getting bad when they had trouble lighting a cigarette or a lighter wouldn't spark. That meant the oxygen level was dropping too low. Then there was the danger of chlorine gas. The submarine's batteries, which powered it underwater, were filled with sulfuric acid. If seawater, which contained salt sodium chloride, washed over the batteries during a storm or due to battle damage, a chemical reaction would produce deadly chlorine gas. This was a submariner's nightmare. Even a small amount could sear the lungs and kill a man in minutes. In naval histories, like Theodore Roscoe's United States submarine operations in World War II, are filled with accounts of boats having to surface in dangerous conditions just to ventilate the ship after a chlorine gas scare. The air was also thick with other contaminants. Diesel fumes, cooking smoke, and the ever-present humidity made the atmosphere heavy and foul. The only real solution was to surface, usually at night, and run the diesel engines. This not only recharged the batteries, but also powered large ventilation fans that would suck the stale, foul air out and replace it with fresh ocean air. Veterans often say the most wonderful sensation in the world was that first breath of clean, cold night air after spending 18 hours submerged in the soup below. What were the specific measured CO2 and O2 levels that were considered acceptable by naval standards of the time? And how often were these limits pushed? Did the chronic exposure to high CO2 and low O2 levels have documented long-term health effects on submariners after the war? Were there alternative experimental air purification systems tested during the war that were ultimately rejected? And if so, why? Number 17, where did everyone sleep? Space on a World War II submarine was the most valuable commodity. Every inch was dedicated to machinery, torpedoes, or food. The crew's living quarters were an afterthought. For most of the enlisted men, sleeping meant hot bunking. This was a system where 2 or even 3 men were assigned to a single bunk. They worked in different shifts, so while one man was on duty, another was sleeping in the bunk. When it was time for the shift change, the man coming off duty would wake up the other man. The bunk was never cold, it was always warm from the last person who slept in it. Hence the name hot bunking. The bunks themselves were small, cramped, and stacked 3 high. They were little more than canvas stretched over a metal frame. There was no privacy. A thin curtain was the only separation from the constant noise and activity of the passageway. And men slept in their clothes, ready to jump to their battle stations at a moment's notice. The bunks were located throughout the boat. And some were in the torpedo rooms, where men slept surrounded by the massive, deadly weapons. Others were crammed into any available nook or cranny. The air was thick and stuffy, and the mattresses were often damp from the constant humidity. Senior petty officers and officers had slightly better accommodations. They might have a 2-man stateroom which was barely the size of a closet with a small desk and a bit more storage space. The captain had his own small cabin, the only private space on the entire boat. This lack of personal space was a major source of psychological stress. For 2 months at a time, a man was never truly alone. He was always within sight and sound of his crewmates. The book Wake of the Wahoo by Forrest J. Sterling gives a vivid account of this crowded life. He describes how men had to learn to move around each other in the narrow passageways, a sort of practice dance to avoid constantly bumping into one another. The bunk was a man's only personal territory, and even that had to be shared. It created an environment with no escape, where a man's ability to get along with others was not just a social grace, but a survival skill. How were bunk assignments determined? Was it by rank, seniority, or the needs of the watch schedule? What were the documented psychological impacts of hot bunking, and the complete lack of privacy on crew morale and efficiency over a long patrol? Are there any records of serious conflicts or fights breaking out among crew members specifically due to the stress of these sleeping arrangements? Number 16. What did they do when they weren't fighting? A submarine patrol could last 60 days or more, and most of that time was not spent in combat. It was spent in a state of extreme boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The crew had to find ways to pass the long hours, submerged and isolated from the outside world. The primary form of entertainment was reading. The submarines had a small library of books, usually donated paperbacks. They were passed around until their covers fell off. Men would read anything they could get their hands on, from westerns and mysteries to classic literature. Magazines were also popular, though they quickly became outdated. Movies were another treasured escape. The boat would have a 16mm film projector and a small library of Hollywood films. A sheet would be hung up in the mess hall or the forward torpedo room, and the men would crowd in to watch. They would see the same movies over and over again on a long patrol until they knew every line of dialogue by heart. In his book, Thunder Below, Admiral Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb describes how movie nights were a critical morale booster. It was a chance for the crew to forget where they were for a couple of hours. Card games were everywhere, and cribbage, poker, and bridge were constantly being played in the mess halls. These games were more than just a way to pass the time, they were a way to build camaraderie and relieve stress. And gambling was officially forbidden, but small stakes games were usually tolerated by the officers. Music was also important. The boats had record players, and the crew would listen to the popular music of the day: Glenn Miller, the Andrews Sisters, Bing Crosby. Some men brought their own instruments like guitars or harmonicas and would hold impromptu jam sessions. And then there was the work. There was always work to be done. Maintenance, cleaning, drills. The constant practice was a way to keep skills sharp and to combat the monotony. A sailor's life was a cycle of watch standing, eating, sleeping, and trying to find something to do in between. This boredom was a serious challenge. It could lead to depression and conflict. A good captain knew that keeping his crew busy and entertained was just as important as keeping the engines running. What were the most requested movie genres and specific films among submarine crews? Was there a black market for books and magazines with crew members trading them like currency? How did the U.S. Navy's Armed Forces Radio Service, which began broadcasting in 1942, impact life on submarines that could receive the signals while surfaced? Number 15, could you stomach the food after 6 weeks? Food on a submarine was a constant topic of conversation. It was one of the few pleasures available and a key factor in crew morale. At the beginning of a patrol, the food was excellent. The Navy knew that a well-fed crew was a happy crew, so submarines were given the best food available. The freezers were packed with steak, chicken, and pork. The dry storage rooms were overflowing with canned goods. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and even eggs were crammed into every possible space. For the first week or two, the men ate like kings. The cook, or steward, was one of the most important men on the boat. A good cook could keep morale high, while a bad one could make a long patrol miserable. He had to be incredibly creative, working in a tiny hot galley with limited equipment, but as the patrol wore on, things changed. The fresh food was the first to go. The potatoes would start to sprout, the lettuce would wilt, and the bread would grow mold. The smell of rotting vegetables would sometimes permeate the boat. After a few weeks, the crew was living almost entirely on canned and dried goods. The menu became repetitive. Canned beans, powdered eggs, Spam, and dehydrated potatoes were staples. According to the book U.S. Submarine Operations in World War II, the quality of food was directly linked to the success of a patrol. A crew that felt well cared for performed better. The creativity of the cooks became legendary. They would try to make canned goods more interesting by adding spices or baking them into different dishes. On special occasions, like crossing the equator, they might bake a cake or make ice cream with a hand-cranked machine. Finding space for all this food was a major challenge. Cans of food were stored under the decks, in the passageways, even in the shower stalls. For the first part of a patrol, the men would literally be walking on their food. As the food was consumed, it created more space, which made the boat feel slightly less cramped. By the end of a 60-day patrol, the crew was tired of the food. They dreamed of fresh milk, a crisp salad, or a simple hamburger. The first meal back in port was a moment of pure joy. What specific innovations in food preservation and packaging, like dehydration and flash freezing, were first widely tested on submarine patrols? Were there nutritional deficiency diseases like scurvy or beriberi ever reported on extremely long patrols? How did the diet on a U.S. submarine compare to that on a German or Japanese submarine in terms of calories, variety, and quality? Number 14, what did you wear when your uniform rotted? The classic image of a submariner is a man in a crisp Navy uniform. Like, the reality was very different. For most of a patrol, there was no uniform of the day. The goal was comfort and practicality in a hot, humid, and dirty environment. When a submarine left port, the men would be in their standard issue dungarees or khaki uniforms. But as soon as the boat was at sea, the rules relaxed. The most common uniform was a pair of shorts or cut-off pants, and maybe a t-shirt. Many men simply went without a shirt. Shoes were optional, and many crew members preferred to be barefoot or in sandals. The constant heat and humidity, especially in the Pacific, made wearing a full uniform unbearable. The engine rooms could reach temperatures of over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was always damp, and clothes never truly dried. This environment was brutal on clothing. The fabric would become saturated with sweat, diesel oil, and the general grime of the boat. Mildew and rot would set in. It wasn't uncommon for a pair of pants or a shirt to literally fall apart by the end of a patrol. And laundry facilities were non-existent. The only way to wash clothes was to do it by hand in a bucket using saltwater soap. But fresh water for rinsing was too precious to spare. The alternative, known as trailing laundry, involved putting your clothes in a mesh bag, tying it to a line, and throwing it overboard while the submarine was on the surface. The motion of the boat through the water would agitate the clothes. It was better than nothing, but it left the clothes stiff and smelling of salt. Because of this, men wore the same clothes for days or even weeks at a time. The concept of clean clothes was a luxury reserved for their return to port. This lack of hygiene contributed to skin problems like rashes and fungal infections, which were a constant complaint. Clay Blair's authoritative history, Silent Victory, mentions these mundane details as being crucial to understanding the daily life of the crew. The focus was on keeping the machinery running and the men at their posts, not on military appearance. A man's worth was measured by his skills, not by how neat his uniform was. Aside from basic clothing, what personal items did the Navy allow submariners to bring on patrol, and what were the most commonly confiscated items? Did the different branches of the submarine service, like torpedo men versus radio men, develop their own unofficial dress codes or styles? Were there any attempts to design and issue specialized tropical weight or mildew-resistant clothing specifically for submarine crews in the Pacific? Number 13, how did you use the toilet? It's not a glamorous topic, but sanitation is a critical issue in a closed environment. On a submarine, the toilets or heads were a constant source of trouble and anxiety. A typical fleet submarine had only 2 or 3 heads for a crew of 80 men. They were small, cramped, and prone to malfunctioning. The system was complex because the submarine was operating under pressure. You couldn't just flush a toilet like you do at home. Flushing the wrong way could have disastrous consequences. It involved a series of valves that had to be opened and closed in the correct sequence. And a mistake could result in a phenomenon known as back pressure, where the contents of the toilet, along with seawater, would be violently expelled back into the compartment. This was not only incredibly messy and disgusting, but it could also flood the compartment with seawater, which was a serious danger. New crew members were given careful instruction on how to operate the head, but mistakes still happened. The problem was even more acute on some foreign submarines. The German Type 7 U-boats, for example, had a notoriously complicated high-pressure toilet system that was very difficult to operate, especially when the boat was submerged deep. There are historical accounts, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, of at least one U-boat, the U-1206, which was lost in April 1945 due to a toilet malfunction. According to the story, a mistake in operating the head caused a flood that reached the batteries, creating chlorine gas and forcing the boat to surface, where it was then attacked. While the exact chain of events is debated by historians, it highlights the very real dangers associated with these seemingly simple systems. The heads were also a constant source of foul odors that contributed to the overall smell of the boat, and cleaning them was one of the worst jobs on the submarine, usually assigned to the most junior sailors. The simple act of using the toilet was a daily reminder of the precarious and unnatural world they lived in, a world where one wrong move with a valve could create a personal and a professional disaster. What was the official training manual procedure for operating a submarine head, and how often were accidents officially logged in patrol reports? Did American submarine designs have a demonstrably simpler or more reliable sanitation system compared to their German or Japanese counterparts? Beyond the U-1206 incident, are there other documented cases where a submarine's mission was compromised or endangered by a failure of the sanitation system? Number 12. What sound meant you were about to die? In the silent world of the submarine, sound was everything. The hydrophone operator wearing his headphones was the ears of the boat. He could identify the sounds of different ships by the noise of their propellers and engines. He could hear the faint, distant hiss of a torpedo moving through the water. But there was one sound that every submariner dreaded above all others, the ping of active sonar. Sonar, or what the British called ASDIC, was the primary tool for hunting submarines. An enemy destroyer would send out a pulse of sound energy, a ping. This sound would travel through the water, and if it hit the hull of a submarine, it would bounce back as an echo. The time it took for the echo to return told the destroyer the range to the submarine. As the destroyer got closer, the pings would get louder and more frequent. For the men inside the submarine, it was a terrifying sound. It meant they had been found. It meant the hunt was on. And it meant that depth charges were coming. The sound of a depth charge exploding underwater is unlike anything else. It's not just a loud bang, it's a violent physical concussion that slams into the hull of the submarine. In his memoir, Iron Coffins, Herbert Warner describes it vividly. First comes a sharp metallic crack as the shockwave hits the steel hull. Then, the whole boat is violently shaken as if by a giant hand. Lights flicker and go out, cork insulation and paint chips rain down from the ceiling. Pipes burst and water sprays into the compartments. Men are thrown from their feet. And all the while, the pinging continues, a constant metallic heartbeat counting down to the next explosion. This experience was known as a depth charging. A submarine might endure hours of this, forced to stay deep and silent while the destroyers circled above, dropping their deadly charges. The psychological toll was immense. Men had to fight to control their fear, to continue doing their jobs while the world around them was being torn apart. The captain had to make split-second decisions, maneuvering the boat to try to escape the pattern of depth charges. It was a brutal, nerve-shattering experience. The sound of that ping was the sound of pure, helpless vulnerability. How did the frequency and pitch of the sonar ping change as a hunter-killer ship zeroed in on a submarine's position? What specific evasive maneuvers, like creating a knuckle in the water by changing speed and depth, were most effective at breaking a sonar lock? Were there any countermeasures developed during the war, such as decoys that could emit a false sonar signal, and how successful were they? Number 11. How did you know where you were? Today, we can pinpoint our location on the globe in seconds with GPS. In the 1940s, deep under the ocean, finding your position was a complex art. Navigation was one of the most critical and difficult jobs on a submarine. The primary method of navigation underwater was called dead reckoning. This is the process of calculating your current position by using a previously determined position or a fix, and then advancing that position based upon known or estimated speeds over elapsed time and course. The navigator would start with the last known good position, usually taken from a celestial fix, the last time the boat was on the surface. Then he would use the boat's compass for direction and the propeller speed to estimate the distance traveled. He would constantly be updating his position on the chart, drawing a line that represented the submarine's presumed track. But dead reckoning is inherently inaccurate. Ocean currents could push the boat off course in ways that were impossible to measure while submerged. Errors in the compass or the speed log would accumulate over time. The longer a submarine stayed submerged, the less certain the navigator was of its true position. This was a huge problem. An accurate position was essential for finding the enemy, for avoiding known minefields, and for making a successful attack. A navigator who was off by even a few miles could cause the submarine to miss its target entirely. To correct the dead reckoning position, the navigator had to get a new fix. The best way to do this was with a sextant. This required the submarine to be on the surface with a clear view of the sky. At night, the navigator would measure the angle of certain stars above the horizon. During the day, he would measure the angle of the sun at noon. Using these measurements in a set of complex tables in the nautical almanac, he could calculate his latitude and longitude with great accuracy. This information comes from sources like the Manual of the Celestial Navigation by Arthur A. Egerton, which was a standard U.S. Navy text at the time. The navigator, usually a junior officer, was under constant pressure. The captain's decisions and the lives of the crew depended on the accuracy of his charts. What were the other less common methods of navigation used, such as bathymetric navigation, which uses soundings of the ocean floor to match against a chart? How did magnetic anomalies on the seafloor or variations in the Earth's magnetic field affect the accuracy of submarine compasses? Are there documented patrol reports where a major navigational error led to a significant mission failure or the near loss of the boat? Number 10, were there any strange rituals? Life on a submarine was governed by routine and naval regulations, but it was also a world of strange traditions and superstitions. These rituals helped to build crew cohesion and relieve the stress of long, dangerous patrols. One of the most famous was the Blue Nose ceremony. This was an initiation for sailors who crossed the Arctic Circle for the first time. The man being initiated would be brought before King Neptune, usually a senior petty officer dressed in a costume at his court. He would have to perform a series of humiliating but harmless tasks, like having his hair cut in a strange way or being doused with ice-cold water. At the end of the ceremony, his nose would be painted blue, signifying his new status as a blue nose or a son of Neptune. A similar and much older ceremony was held for crossing the equator. Sailors who had not yet crossed the line were called polywogs, or those who were called shellbacks. The crossing the line ceremony was a day-long event, often rougher than the Arctic version, where the polywogs were hazed by the shellbacks before being welcomed into the ancient order of the deep. These ceremonies, described in many naval memoirs like Edward L. Beach's Submarine, were a way to break the monotony of a patrol and to mark a significant milestone in a sailor's career. Superstitions were also common. Whistling was often considered bad luck, as it was thought to whistle up a storm. Some captains had lucky charms or a particular routine they would follow before an attack. Launching a patrol on a Friday was also seen by some as a bad omen. Another unique tradition was the battle flag. Many successful submarines would create a flag, often a Jolly Roger or a custom design on which they would record their accomplishments. Each successful attack would be marked with a symbol, and the flag would be flown proudly when the submarine returned to port. These rituals and superstitions may seem silly, but they served an important purpose. They created a unique culture, a shared set of experiences that bonded the crew together. In a world of extreme danger and uncertainty, these traditions provided a sense of order, identity, and control. What were the specific origins of the Blue Nose and shellback ceremonies? And how did the submarine versions of these rituals differ from those on surface ships? Were there any submarine crews that were known for being particularly superstitious, and did this ever affect their operational decisions? Are there any documented instances where a hazing ritual went wrong and resulted in injury or a serious breakdown in discipline? Number 9, how cold and hot could it get? Life on a submarine was a life of extreme temperatures. The boat could go from being a sweltering oven to a freezing icebox in a matter of hours. And the crew had to live and work in these conditions for months on end. The heat was usually the biggest problem, especially for boats operating in the Pacific or the Mediterranean. When the submarine was submerged, there was no way to get rid of the heat generated by the machinery and the bodies of 80 men. The air conditioning systems of the time were primitive and often broke down. Temperatures inside the boat could easily climb to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the engine room it could be as high as 125 degrees. The humidity was often near 100%. The air was thick, wet, and stagnant. Condensation would form on the cold steel hull and drip down constantly, making everything damp. Men would be drenched in sweat all day long. This led to skin problems like heat rash and fungal infections known as jungle rot. As documented in numerous patrol logs archived by the U.S. Navy, dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant concerns. But then, things could change quickly. When the submarine surfaced at night, especially in a northern latitude, the temperature could plummet. The rush of cold night air into the boat could feel wonderful at first, but it could also make the interior damp and chilly. Men standing watch on the bridge would have to bundle up in heavy coats and hats to protect themselves from the freezing wind and spray. The most dramatic temperature shifts happened during a deep dive. As the submarine went deeper, the surrounding water became much colder. The steel hull would contract and cool, and the temperature inside the boat would drop significantly. It wasn't uncommon for men to be sweating in 100-degree heat one moment and then shivering in a 50-degree chill the next. This constant fluctuation between extreme heat and cold was physically draining. It added another layer of discomfort and stress to an already difficult existence. The men had to be incredibly tough and adaptable to function in such an environment. How did the rudimentary air conditioning and ventilation systems on a Gatto-class submarine actually work? And what was their cooling capacity in British thermal units BTUs? Were there differences in the insulation materials used on submarines designed for Atlantic versus Pacific operations? What were the official Navy guidelines for water consumption and salt tablets to prevent heat stroke in these extreme conditions? Number 8, who were the men who volunteered for this? The submarine service was an all-volunteer force. No one was drafted into submarine duty. Every man on board, from the captain to the lowest-ranking seaman, had chosen to be there. And they were a special breed. The selection process was rigorous. Candidates had to pass a series of tough physical and psychological exams. They were looking for men who were intelligent, stable, and able to work well in a team under extreme pressure. While claustrophobia was an obvious disqualifier, the training was even tougher. At the submarine school in New London, Connecticut, trainees were pushed to their limits. They had to learn every system on the boat, from the diesel engines to the torpedo tubes. They spent hours in a diving tower learning how to escape from a sunken submarine using a device called the Momsen lung. This training was designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the mental and physical stress. The men who made it through were a diverse group. They came from all over the country, from all walks of life. The average age was young, mostly in their late teens and early 20s. But they all shared a few key traits. They were highly motivated. Submarine duty was dangerous, but it also came with perks. Submariners received 50% extra pay, known as sub pay, and the food was considered the best in the Navy. There was also a certain prestige associated with being a bubblehead, as they were sometimes called. They were also fiercely loyal to their boat and their crewmates. In that confined world, every man depended on every other man to do his job perfectly. There was no room for error. This created an incredible bond, a sense of brotherhood that was stronger than on any surface ship. In his book, Silent Victory, Clay Blair Jr. emphasizes that the success of the U.S. submarine force was built on the quality of these men. They were not daredevils or thrill seekers. They were disciplined professionals who had volunteered for the most dangerous and demanding job in the Navy. They understood the risks and they accepted them. What were the specific psychological tests used in the 1940s to screen for submarine candidates, and how effective were they at predicting performance under stress? What was the washout rate at the New London Submarine School during the peak of the war? How did the demographic profile of a typical U.S. submarine crew in terms of age, education, and geographic origin compare to that of a typical surface ship crew? Number 7. Could you really trust a pharmacist's mate with your life? We already discussed the incredible surgery performed by Wheeler B. Lipes, but the day-to-day role of the pharmacist's mate was just as critical. He was the sole guardian of the crew's health on a long and isolated patrol, and his job went far beyond handing out pills. The pharmacist's mate, or doc, was responsible for preventative medicine. He was in charge of hygiene and sanitation, constantly inspecting the galley, the mess halls, and the berthing compartments to prevent the spread of disease. In such a crowded environment, an outbreak of something like dysentery or influenza could be catastrophic. He also served as the crew's dentist. Toothaches were a common problem, and a severe one could incapacitate a man. The doc had a basic set of dental tools and was trained to perform extractions. It was a brutal, painful procedure, but it was often the only option. But perhaps his most important role was as a counselor. The psychological strain of submarine life was immense. The combination of confinement, boredom, and constant danger took a toll on the men. The doc was often the one they would talk to about their fears, their problems at home, and their conflicts with crewmates. He had to be a good listener, a trusted confidant, and an amateur psychologist. A 1943 article in the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery newsletter highlighted the expanding role of these men, noting they had to be a jack of all trades and master of most of them. The doc's medical knowledge was constantly being tested. He treated everything from minor cuts and bruises to the severe injuries caused by a depth charge attack. He had a small library of medical textbooks, and he often had to consult them in the middle of a crisis. The trust that the crew placed in him was absolute. They knew that he was not a fully trained doctor, but they also knew that he was dedicated, resourceful, and would do everything in his power to save a life. He was a symbol of hope and security in a world where both were in short supply. How extensive was the medical and dental training provided to a pharmacist's mate before he was assigned to a submarine? Were there standard medical kits issued to all submarines, and what were the most common drugs and supplies they contained? Are there records of how pharmacist mates dealt with mental health crises such as severe depression or psychotic breaks among the crew in complete isolation? Number 6, how did you keep from going crazy? For 60 days, you are trapped in a steel tube. You see the same 80 faces every day. You can't go outside. You can't talk to your family. You live with the constant threat of a sudden violent death. How do you stay sane? This was the central challenge of submarine life. The U.S. Navy was very aware of the psychological pressures. The screening process was designed to select men who were mentally resilient, but even the strongest minds were tested. One of the key survival mechanisms was a dark, cynical sense of humor. Submariners developed a unique brand of gallows humor. They would joke about death, about being trapped, about the absurdity of their situation. This was not because they were callous. It was a way to control their fear. By laughing at the things that scared them, they could rob them of their power. Routine was another essential tool. The rigid structure of the watch schedule, the daily maintenance tasks, the regular meal times, all of this provided a sense of order and predictability in a chaotic world. It kept the men focused on the task at hand and prevented them from dwelling on their anxieties. The social structure of the crew was also critical. The intense camaraderie and interdependence created a powerful support system. Men looked out for each other. They knew that their survival depended on the man next to them. This shared sense of purpose helped to combat the feelings of isolation and hopelessness. Hobbies were also encouraged. Men would build model airplanes, write letters, or study for correspondence courses. Anything that could occupy the mind and provide a sense of personal accomplishment was valuable. The book, The Fleet Type Submarine Manual, published by the Navy, even had sections on maintaining morale, recognizing the importance of recreation and mental engagement. But despite all this, the strain was immense. Some men did break, but most endured. They did it by relying on their training, their sense of humor, and most of all, each other. They learned to live in a world that was unlike any other, and they found a way to not just survive, but to function at a high level under conditions that would crush an ordinary person. Were formal psychological studies conducted on returning submarine crews to assess the prevalence of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. How did captains and executive officers identify and manage a crew member who was showing signs of a serious mental breakdown during a patrol? Did the rate of psychological casualties differ between crews on highly successful, aggressive patrols versus those on long, uneventful ones? Number 5, was there any privacy at all? The short answer is no. On a fleet submarine with a crew of 80, the concept of personal privacy simply did not exist. Every aspect of a man's life was public. When you ate, you were elbow to elbow with your crewmates in the mess hall. When you slept, you were in a bunk with men sleeping inches above, below, and across from you. Even the most personal bodily functions were semi-public events in the cramped, busy heads. The only truly private space on the entire boat was the captain's cabin, and even that was small and located in a busy area. This total lack of privacy had a profound effect on the crew. Men had to learn to live in a state of constant social interaction. There was no place to go to be alone with your thoughts, to read a letter from home in peace, or to have a private conversation. Any argument, any personal problem, any display of emotion was witnessed by everyone. This forced the men to become masters of self-control. Outbursts of anger or frustration were a serious breach of an unwritten code. You learned to keep your problems to yourself or to discuss them in quiet whispers with a trusted friend. The letters from home were a lifeline to the outside world, but they were also a source of anxiety. Reading about problems at home that you were powerless to solve was a unique form of torture, and there was no privacy to even absorb that bad news. As described in many personal accounts, such as in Forrest Sterling's Wake of the Wahoo, a man would have to find a corner and try to process his emotions while life on the boat swirled around him. This environment also meant that there were no secrets. Everyone knew everyone else's business. This could foster a sense of closeness and family, but it could also lead to gossip and friction. A man's reputation was everything. His skills, his work ethic, his personality, all were on constant display. There was no hiding who you were on a submarine. It was perhaps the ultimate test of a man's ability to live in a community. How did the design of the crew's quarters evolve in later submarine classes, like the Below and Tench classes, to address the issue of privacy, if at all? Were there any informal rules or gentlemen's agreements among the crew to grant a man temporary privacy, for example, after receiving bad news from home? What were the most common sources of interpersonal conflict that arose specifically from the complete lack of personal space? Number 4, what was the most dangerous job? Every job on a submarine was dangerous. A single mistake by anyone, from the cook to the captain, could doom the entire crew. But some jobs carried a higher level of daily, personal risk than others. The men who worked in the engine rooms, the Black Gang, faced constant danger. They worked in extreme heat and noise, surrounded by powerful high-speed machinery. A ruptured fuel line could cause a fire. A burst steam pipe could scald a man to death in seconds. They had to be constantly vigilant, listening for any change in the sound of the engines that might signal a problem. The torpedomen also had a high-risk job. They were responsible for handling the boat's primary weapons. The torpedoes of that era were complex and sometimes unreliable. They were filled with thousands of pounds of high explosives. The propulsion systems could use compressed air or, in some cases, volatile substances like hydrogen peroxide. A leak or a malfunction during maintenance could be catastrophic. The book Iron Men, Wooden Women, The Story of the Submarine, L10 by Edmund L. Castillo describes the inherent dangers faced by the early submariners handling these weapons. But arguably the most dangerous and most exposed job belonged to the lookouts on the bridge. When the submarine was on the surface, a team of lookouts would be stationed on the open bridge, scanning the horizon for enemy ships and aircraft. They were completely exposed to the elements of freezing winds, pounding waves, and blistering sun. A rogue wave could wash a man overboard, and in the dark of night, his chances of being found were almost zero. They were also the first line of defense and the first target. If the submarine was spotted by an enemy plane, the lookouts on the bridge were the most vulnerable to machine gun fire. The decision to clear the bridge and dive had to be made in seconds. The last man down the hatch was the captain, but the lookouts had to scramble down before him. It was a job that required incredible stamina, sharp eyesight, and nerves of steel. In a way, their jobs symbolized the submarine itself, a tiny, vulnerable outpost in a vast and hostile ocean. What was the standard watch rotation for lookouts, and what specific training did they receive to identify ship and aircraft silhouettes at a distance? How many submariners were officially lost at sea due to being washed overboard from the bridge during the war? Did the design of the bridge and its fair water change over the course of the war to provide more protection for the lookouts? Number 3, could a whole submarine be powered by batteries? When a submarine was submerged, its powerful diesel engines were useless. They needed air to run, and there was no air underwater. The boat's underwater propulsion came from a completely different source, massive electric motors powered by batteries. These weren't like the battery in your car. A World War II fleet submarine had 2 huge battery wells, each containing 126 massive cells. Each cell was the size of a small refrigerator and weighed over a ton. Together they formed a giant storage battery that could power the boat for a limited time. The technology was lead acid, the same basic chemistry used today. This system had major limitations. The batteries had a finite charge. At high speeds, a submarine could drain its batteries in as little as an hour. At a very slow creeping speed of 2 or 3 knots, it might be able to stay submerged for up to 48 hours. This created a constant strategic problem for the captain. Every minute spent submerged was a minute of battery life gone forever. He had to carefully manage his battery power, balancing the need for stealth with the need to be in the right place at the right time. The batteries could only be recharged by running the diesel engines on the surface. This was a moment of great vulnerability. A submarine on the surface was a visible, noisy target, so recharging was almost always done at night. The boat would surface, and the diesels would roar to life, driving the electric motors, which now acted as generators to pump power back into the batteries. This process could take 8 hours or more. The state of the battery charge was a constant concern. According to naval operational manuals from the period, like the Submarine Operations Manual, a captain would never deliberately enter combat with a low battery charge if it could be avoided. A full battery meant speed and endurance, the two things you needed most to escape after an attack. Life in the battery wells was also dangerous for the crew, who had to maintain them. The cells were filled with corrosive sulfuric acid, and during charging, they produced explosive hydrogen gas. A single spark could cause a massive explosion. The entire submarine, in essence, was a delicate balancing act between the air-breathing power of its diesels and the silent, finite power of its batteries. What was the total energy capacity of the battery banks on a Gatto-class submarine measured in kilowatt hours? What was the expected service life of a set of submarine batteries, and how difficult was the process of replacing them? Were there any experimental battery technologies, like nickel iron or other chemistries, tested for submarine use during the war? Number 2, how did they get out if the submarine sank? This was the question that haunted every submariner. What happens if the boat is damaged and sinks to the bottom? The chances of survival were slim, but there was a system in place, and the men were trained to use it. The primary escape device was the Momsen lung. Developed in the 1920s by Charles Swede, Momsen, it was essentially a rubber bag that recycled air. A man would place a mouthpiece in his mouth, a clip on his nose, and the bag over his chest. It contained a canister of soda lime, which would scrub the carbon dioxide from his exhaled breath. The man could then rebreathe the oxygen in the bag. The training was intense. At the submarine school in New London, men would practice ascending from the bottom of a 100-foot-tall escape training tower. This was not just to learn how to use the device, but to learn how to deal with the pressure changes during a rapid ascent. Ascending too quickly could cause the bends, a painful and often fatal condition. The escape plan itself was a desperate last-ditch effort. The surviving crew would gather in one of the submarine's escape trunks, which were small, airtight compartments. They would seal the door to the rest of the submarine. Then, they would slowly flood the compartment with water from the sea. As the water level rose, the air pressure in the compartment would increase until it matched the pressure of the sea outside. Once the pressure was equalized, they could open the outer hatch. One by one, the men would exit the submarine and begin their long, slow ascent to the surface, guided by a line. It was an incredibly dangerous procedure. The success of an escape depended on many factors: the depth of the water, the temperature, and the physical condition of the men. There were very few documented cases of successful mass escapes from a sunken submarine during the war. One of the most famous submarine disasters, the loss of the USS Squalus in 1939, during a test dive, actually provided a different, more successful rescue method. But this method required a dedicated rescue ship to be on the scene. For most submarines lost in deep enemy waters, there was no hope of rescue. The Momsen lung was their only chance, and it was a slim one. What was the maximum depth from which a successful escape using a Momsen lung was considered theoretically possible? Were there any competing escape technologies developed by other navies, and how did they compare to the Momsen lung? How many individual submariners are documented to have successfully escaped from a sunken submarine during the war using any method? Number 1, what really held it all together? It wasn't the steel hull. It wasn't the powerful engines or the deadly torpedoes. The single most important element in a World War II submarine was the crew. More specifically, it was the intricate social structure and the absolute unwavering trust that every man had in every other man on the boat. This wasn't just about friendship, it was a professional necessity. The radio man had to trust that the lookout would spot a threat in time. The lookout had to trust that the helmsman would respond instantly to a command. The helmsman had to trust that the diving officer would maintain the proper depth. The diving officer had to trust that the engineers would keep the motors running. And everyone had to trust the captain. The captain was the absolute authority. His word was law. But this authority was not based on fear, it was based on competence. The crew had to believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that their captain was the smartest, calmest, and most capable man on the boat. He had to know his ship, his crew, and his enemy better than anyone. Men like Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang or Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb became legends because their crews had this kind of faith in them. This trust was built through endless training and drills. It was forged in the heat of shared experience, in the terror of a depth charging, and in the quiet satisfaction of a successful patrol. It was a culture where incompetence was not tolerated, because a single weak link could kill everyone. The book Submarine Commander, by Ben Bryant, a British submariner, talks at length about this dynamic. He calls it the submarine spirit. It was a combination of professionalism, discipline, and an unspoken bond. They were a family, a tribe, sealed together in a steel tube. They argued, they got on each other's nerves, but when the alarm bells rang, they functioned as a single organism, a single mind focused on one goal: survival. This human element, this web of trust and dependence, was more powerful than any piece of technology on the boat. It's what allowed them to endure the unimaginable and to function as one of the most effective fighting forces of the war. What were the key leadership traits that the Navy identified and looked for when selecting submarine commanders? Are there any documented cases of a submarine crew losing faith in their captain and the subsequent impact on the boat's performance and safety? How was this intense crew cohesion and trust reestablished when replacement crew members had to be brought in to fill the spots of those who were lost or transferred?